clauses, it is important to review what an
We'll do guided practice with adverb clause exercises to prepare you to work on your own. Let's review a little about adverb clauses. You learned that they function as adverbs in a sentence. They tell how, as exercises to prepare you to work on your own. Let's review a little about adverb clauses. You learned that they function as adverbs in a sentence. They tell how. For example, you could use an adverb quickly, or you could use an adverb clause, as soon as I can. They tell when, like later or after I'm finished. They tell where, like back or where I was before. Also, adverb clauses can tell us why, like because I want to, or under what conditions, if I have time. In the last video, you learned about a necessary part of every adverb clause, subordinating conjunctions. Before, you saw these subordinating conjunctions. These are just some of the many subordinating conjunctions in English. Subordinating conjunctions start all adverb clauses, and they're the reason why adverb clauses are dependent clauses. Here, I'll help you to do some exercises that you'll see in your independent practice. How can you identify a subordinating conjunction in a sentence? Here are some tips. First, find the subject-verb groups. Here they are. Those are two separate clauses. Next, check the beginning of each clause. Do you see the subordinating conjunction? Here it is. Now you try. Take a moment to follow the tips. Did you find the subject-verb groups here? Great. Then, did you check the beginning of each clause? Did you see this subordinating conjunction? If you did, then high five. Our next type of exercise helps you to find independent clauses and dependent adverb clauses. Let's look at these tips. First, find the subject-verb groups. There they are. Check. Next, check the beginning of each clause. Is there a subordinating conjunction? Yes. Finally, the dependent clause starts with the subordinating conjunction, and the clause that can stand alone is independent. Now you try. Pause or stop the video and follow the tips. Okay, there were two subject-verb groups, that's two clauses. Next, at the beginning of the first clause, there's a subordinating conjunction. Check. That means that this is the dependent clause and this is the independent clause. Finally, let's practice deciding if the sentence is complete or incomplete. This will really help you when you're editing or fixing your own writing. Here are some new tips. First, find the two subject-verb groups that make the two clauses. There's only one subject-verb group. Okay, now, is this an independent clause? You've got to have an independent clause in every complete sentence. No, if you look here, you'll see a subordinating conjunction. This is a dependent clause. No independent clause, no sentence. This is incomplete. Now, how can we make this incomplete sentence complete? Add a comma and an independent clause. Now we have a second subject-verb group, and this clause can stand on its own. It's independent. This sentence is now complete. Complete or incomplete? Pause or stop the video and think. Then play again. Let's check your answer. First, there's only one subject-verb group. Not good. Next, there's a subordinating conjunction, so this is a dependent clause. No independent clause means it's incomplete. Think, how can we make it complete? Can you think of an independent clause to add? Take a moment. I added this independent clause with a subject-verb group, but if you had a different idea, that's okay, as long as you had a subject-verb group that could stand on its own. Okay, now you're ready to practice on your own. Emily needed a wall for support, and if you feel like you need more support while you're working on these exercises, just watch these videos again for help. Have fun!
Here she comes.
I'm so excited!
Yeah, dinner party.
Yeah. How can I help you?
You know what? Thank you so much for helping. What would be really helpful is if you could just give me some rice.
Rice. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
That'd be awesome.
Okay.
I'll get one.
Totally. Oh, which one's rice? How many people are coming to dinner?
10, I think. 10 total.
Okay. I got you some rice.
Awesome.
Here you go.
What's this?
Is this not the rice you wanted? I mean, it expands when you cook it, so I know it doesn't look like a lot now. Is that the wrong kind of rice?
You're great. You know, I will. How about this? I'll take care of the rice. Okay, and you can. You know what I want you to do? I want you to just heat up some water for me. Okay. You can just heat up some water.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I can heat up water. Okay, hot water, no problem. This. Okay. How long does it usually take to get hot?
Oh, you've got to. I don't know. You just have to boil it.
I'm trying, but how
What
long?
are you doing?
You told me you wanted hot water. I'm sorry.
God. Okay, you know, that's fine. I've got a better job for you, all right? Rice, water, I've got it under control. You know what I want you to do? Okay?
Okay.
I need you to take a napkin.
Okay.
And then fold it right in half.
A
right
square.
Like that. A
I'm
square.
good at
Yeah.
geometry. Okay, I have a ruler. I can make sure they're perfect squares.
Okay, I need 10 of those.
This is important, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Extremely.
I'm on it. I'm
counting on you. Don't let me down. Pies. Our pies are done. There you
Thank
go.
you.
I hope they came out.
Oh.
I'm excited to see them.
Yeah.
How does yours look? What happened to your pie?
Punctuation and placement of adverb clauses. We already know that a complex sentence with an adverb clause has two subject-verb groups, one or more dependent clauses, and one independent clause. Let's talk now about punctuating these types of clauses. What's punctuation? Punctuation is putting in symbols like question marks, periods, or commas, to name a few. We'll talk about using commas in adverb clauses. Adverb clauses can be placed in different parts of a complex sentence. Most commonly, you'll see them at the end or the beginning of a sentence. Whether you put them at the end or the beginning is usually your personal preference. The meaning stays the same. Now, notice the difference between the punctuation in these sentences. Both have a period, of course, but the second sentence also has a comma in the middle. So when the adverb clause comes at the end, no comma between the clauses. However, when the adverb clause comes at the beginning, use a comma after it to separate the clause from the independent clause. You can also put an adverb clause in a different place, in the middle of the independent clause. This is not very common. We only use it when we want to interrupt the main thought to add in some extra information. Jake, even though she's clueless, insists on helping Emily. When you place the adverb clause in the middle of the independent clause, use two commas to separate the clause from the independent clause around it. So we've seen three patterns for punctuation. Adverb clause at the end, no comma. Adverb clause at the beginning, use one comma. Adverb clause in the middle, use two commas. These rules apply to almost all sentences with adverb clauses. However, there are a few exceptions. Remember our list of subordinating conjunctions? When we use these subordinating conjunctions of direct contrast, while and whereas, we use commas a little differently. We use while and whereas to show a direct contrast between two nouns, like Jake and Emily. What's the difference in while and whereas? Whereas is more formal. When we use these two conjunctions to express a direct contrast or difference, we always need a comma, whether the clause comes at the beginning or the end. Just be careful with while. It can be used to show direct contrast, just like whereas. While Jake's pie was tiny, Emily's pie looked normal. These are differences. However, we also use while as a time word, like this. Jake folded the napkins while Emily was cooking. Here, while is used to tell that two actions were happening at the same time. In this case, use the normal comma rule. Don't use a comma if the while clause comes at the end. Let's review one more time. Don't use a comma if the adverb clause comes at the end, except with whereas and while for direct contrast. Use a comma if the adverb clause starts the sentence, and use two commas if the adverb clause interrupts the main clause. There's one more thing I want to show you. You can use two adverb clauses in a complex sentence. Here's an example. After they took the pies out of the oven, Jake's pie was really tiny because she didn't follow the recipe. Here, you can see the two adverb clauses. And here is the independent clause. This is usually the best way to organize a sentence with two adverb clauses. Notice that a comma separates the first adverb clause from the independent clause. Now, let's practice. Punctuation and placement of adverb clauses. Guided practice. We'll do some guided practice with punctuating adverb clauses so that you'll be ready to practice on your own and to use the clauses correctly when you write in real life. In the last video, you learned these rules. Don't use a comma if the adverb clause comes at the end, except with whereas and while for direct contrast. Use a comma if the adverb clause starts the sentence, and use two commas if the adverb clause interrupts the main clause. A simple way to remember is, if the clause is at the end, no comma. Beginning, one comma. Middle, two commas. Now let's go through some tips for thinking about punctuating adverb clause sentences. Here's a sentence. Although the pies started out the same size, Jake's pie mysteriously shrunk in the oven. Shrunk, by the way, is the past tense of shrink, to get smaller. First, put a box around the subordinating conjunction and check that it's starting a clause with a subject and a verb. Here's our adverb clause. Next, is this adverb clause at the beginning, middle, or end of the sentence? Here, it's at the beginning. The same size, Jake's pie mysteriously is the past tense of shrink, to get smaller. First, put a box around the subordinating conjunction and check that it's starting a clause with a subject and a verb. Here's our adverb clause. Next, is this adverb clause at the beginning, middle, or end of the sentence? Here, it's at the beginning. Finally, think. Do we need a comma or not? The adverb clause is at the beginning, so that means we need a comma. Put that comma right before the subject of the independent clause, here. Now take a moment to go through the tips with this new sentence on your own. Do we need a comma or commas? Now take a moment to go through the tips with this new sentence on your own. Do clause, here. Now take a moment to go through the tips with this new sentence on your own. Do we need a comma or commas? I'll wait a few seconds. Okay, first, here's the subordinating conjunction with a subject and a verb. Here's the adverb clause. This clause is in the middle of an independent clause. Finally, because it's in the middle, we need two commas. They go after the subject of the independent clause and before the verb. Here's one more. Take a moment to think through the steps on your own. I'll wait a few seconds. Okay, put a box around the subordinating conjunction, if, and be sure there's a subject and verb. This clause is at the end of the sentence. Finally, because it's at the end, we don't need commas. Now, I just want to remind you about our exceptions, while and whereas, but only when they're used for directly contrasting or showing the difference between two things. Always use a comma before these adverb clauses. Okay, now you're ready to practice on your own. If you make a mistake, like Jake did, don't worry. Mistakes are a variety of time and place. In the next group of videos, we'll look at the meaning and use of some common subordinating conjunctions. In this video, we'll look at just 9 of the many subordinating conjunctions of time, and we'll learn about the conjunctions of place. One quick note before we begin. In the following videos, I'll mostly show you complex sentences that look like this, with the dependent clause first. However, with most of the subordinating conjunctions, we can just as easily put the independent clause first. It's just a matter of personal preference. If an adverb clause starts with a time subordinator, we often call it a time clause. First, we'll look at before and after. In the dinner party video, first, Emily tells us her worries about Jake. Next, Jake arrives. Before Jake arrives, Emily tells us about her. Notice, in the before time clause, we have the second action, and in the independent clause, we have the first action. However, it's the opposite with after. After Emily tells us about Jake, she arrives. Here, the time clause has the first action, and the independent clause has the second action. When means at the time. In the video, at the time that Jake arrives, Emily asks her to get some rice. When Jake arrives, Emily asks her to get some rice. The first action, arrives, goes with when. And the second action, asks, goes in the independent clause. We could also say, when Jake agrees, Emily gives her the bowl. Again, when goes with the first action, and the second action goes in the independent clause. While and as mean during that time. These are for actions that happen at the same time. For example, in the video, Emily is cooking at the same time that Jake is counting grains of rice. So we can say, while Emily cooks, Jake counts the grains of rice. While can go with either action like this. Jake counts the grains of rice while Emily cooks. Notice, we can also use as in the same way. As soon as and once are two subordinators that mean soon after. In the video, when Jake finishes counting out the rice, she hands the rice to Emily. Soon after that, Emily looks at Jake incredulously. That means she can't believe what she's seeing. We could say, as soon as Jake hands the rice over, Emily looks at her incredulously. Or we could use once in the place of as soon as. They mean the same thing. Note that with as soon as and once, the two actions happen very close together in time. Finally, until or till means to that time and no longer. For example, after Jake gives Emily the rice, Emily looks annoyed at Jake. However, when she thinks of a new task for Jake, she stops looking annoyed. Until she thinks of a new task for Jake, Emily looks annoyed. Put the second action, the stopping point, with until. and put the first action, looks annoyed, in the independent clause. This means then she no longer looks annoyed. Looking annoyed stopped with thinking of a new task. You can also say till in place of until, but this is very casual and is usually used only in speaking. These are just a few of the common subordinating conjunctions that we use in time clauses. One quick note about future time clauses. Look at these two sentences. When the guests see Jake's pie, they'll be surprised. After the guests eat Jake's cooking, they will probably regret it. Both of these situations talk about the future, after the guests arrive. You can see these future verbs, will be and will regret. However, look at the verbs in the time clauses. They aren't future. That's because we only use present tense in a time clause, a future time clause, even if the situation is happening in the future. So think of a future time clause as a present. Use the present tense. Here's a table with all of the information on time clauses from this video. You may want to pause to read it, to take notes, or to take a picture. Now, let's talk about subordinating conjunctions of place. These are fairly simple. Let's start with where. Emily wants Jake to go where she can't cause confusion. Here, where means at, in, or to the place. Notice that because this is an adverb clause, we will use a subject and a verb after, in that order. Don't get confused with where in a question. Notice the question mark? Here, the verb comes first, and then the subject. Don't do this in an adjective clause. Wherever Jake goes, confusion follows. In this sentence, wherever is a conjunction that means to or in all places or any place. Everywhere can also be used the same way, such as everywhere Jake goes, confusion follows. In the next video, we'll practice together with these types of adverb clauses, so stay tuned. Time and place, guided practice. Let's do some guided practice with subordinating conjunctions of time and place. The first step for learning how to use these conjunctions correctly is to memorize the meanings. Take a look at these subordinating conjunctions of time and these conjunctions of place. You may want to take a picture of these so that you can check the meanings as you're working by yourself. In the practice you'll do after this video, conjunctions of place. You may want to take a picture of these so that you can check the meanings as you're working by yourself. In the practice you'll do after this video, you'll see an exercise that looks like this. A, I work hard until the weekend starts. Or B, until I work hard, the weekend starts. Which one is correct? We know that until mean to that time and no longer, so we can use this meaning to help us. Does it make sense to say, I work hard to when the weekend starts and no longer after that? Or does it make sense to say, until I work hard and no longer after that, the weekend starts? I think you'll agree that A makes more sense if you think about the meaning of until. Let's try one more. A, I cooked the eggs after I ate them. B, after I cooked the eggs, I ate them. After means following the time. Which one makes more sense? If you said B, you're correct. It makes more sense to say, following the time that I cooked the eggs, I ate them. The last type of exercise looks like this. The singer's fans always follow her blank she goes. For this sentence, would you choose where or wherever? First, think about the meaning of each word. Where means to the place, while wherever means any place. Which one makes more sense? If you said B, you're correct. It makes more sense to say wherever because of the word always. This means that it happens in any and all places. So my biggest tip is to learn the meanings for the subordinating conjunctions. This is going to help you practice and use the words correctly. Okay, you're now ready to practice on your own. Have fun!